They built their dream house overlooking Lake Fairley in Vermont. It was called Capitaph, after their classic book, Capitalism and Freedom, in which Milton presented his economic philosophy for the first time.
It was an important book because it opened the eyes of hundreds of thousands of readers and millions ultimately to that we were doing things wrong in so many different public policy areas, and that by analyzing it simply but deeply, one could not only show why it was wrong, but come up with improvements. So Friedman was never content simply to show that something was not working well. He usually came up with ingenious ways to improve it.
Some of Milton's most important thinking is done when work and play can be combined. His scientific focus is always technical economics, predicting the consequences of public policies. Milton's landmark scientific work, A Theory of the Consumption Function, is published in 1957. It will be one of the reasons why, much later, he will win the Nobel Prize in Economics.
Milton already had lost confidence in Keynesian economics and was beginning a counter-revolution through monetarism and a variety of other criticisms of Keynesian economics.
Traditional Keynesian theory relies on the belief that enough government spending can create jobs and trigger spending on goods and services. This, in turn, will create more jobs. But Milton argues that people don't make their spending decisions based on current income or short infusions of cash. They make decisions based on what is called permanent income, what they think they are likely to make over time. Today, Milton's theory is widely accepted. The Years in New England also produce A Monetary History of the United States, published in 1963 with his colleague Anna Schwartz. Most consider this Milton's most influential work.
There were great debates at different conferences about, what were these crazy people saying? I mean, it just wasn't believable.
It was commonly believed that the Great Depression was caused by the failure of capitalism. Milton argues that the cause was a failure of the Federal Reserve.
The crucial date, in my opinion, with respect to the Depression, is not the stock market crash, not Black Thursday. It's December 11th, 1930. That was the day on which the Bank of United States in New York crashed, the biggest bank failure in the history of the United States. It was the occasion on which you needed the Federal Reserve System to come in and restore confidence, flood the country with liquidity, prevent other banks from failing. It did nothing of the kind.
He was, considered an oddball in the profession, and his ideas were ridiculed by many people as being way out, as just supporting, the status quo, supporting big business. I'm sure it was very difficult on him personally and his wife, Rose.
One of those who publicly disagreed with Milton Friedman was John Kenneth Galbraith, President Roosevelt's price czar during World War II, and later, President John Kennedy's ambassador to India.
Mr. Galbraith, would you tell us how you see our economy?
Well, as how I see this control problem, I see it essentially as a problem of responsible action in which, indeed, there is no perfect solution. Wage and price control are an indispensable part of any economic policy that this country can have, and we certainly, I hope, will not again pay attention to the people who are offering us this dream of the free market.
A professor at Harvard University and decidedly Keynesian, he was one of the most popular economists of the day.
Yeah, well, one has to understand that Professor Friedman would blame everything from the First World War to the invasions of Genghis Khan on monetary policy, and would use monetary policy as a cure for both. He's a one cause, one cure man.
Richard Parker is an economist at Harvard and Galbraith's biographer.
I think Galbraith looked on the Chicago economics department and Friedman and the like with bemusement. I mean, I think that he felt that they were part of economics' past, not its future.
Thank you.
What Friedman had to offer, as far as Galbraith was concerned, was some of the finest thinking of the 18th century. And it didn't seem terribly relevant to the 20th.
I think what helped Friedman get through this well were two personal characteristics that were very important. One, he's a tremendous optimist. The second one was his analysis was so clear and straightforward and simple that he believed that he was right on most of these issues and that the profession just hadn't analyzed them sufficiently.
Milton and Rose are first and foremost teachers. One of their most original ideas had everything to do with the power of choice in education.
The full exercise of choice would invigorate the public school system, would improve it. Why? Competition always has that effect. It's a disgrace of the nation, in my opinion, that you should have the inner cities, which are the kind of hells that they now are. Living conditions are deplorable. There's no safety, there's no security, there's no protection. The schools in those areas turn out kids who can't read, who can't write, who can't figure. They have no economic future.
Milton and Rose say that parents should be able to direct their tax money to any school of their choice, public or private, secular or religious. Today, some states and cities are experimenting. Here in Milwaukee, the oldest and largest program in the country is limited to only 15,000 poor students. And the school choice voucher is worth little more than half of what would be spent on a child in a public school. Mesmer High School and its elementary school are private inner-city Catholic schools, certainly no bastions of privilege. Students come from some of the poorest, roughest neighborhoods in the city. Tiara Gibson recently transferred to Mesmer.
I wouldn't want to be anywhere else because the atmosphere here is great. The school I went to for my first 2 years of high school was a public school, and it was supposed to be a college-bound school, but you had metal detectors to walk through to get to class certain times of the year. Students yelling, screaming, cursing, fighting. It was just horrible.
The state of Wisconsin requires that voucher schools take every child who applies, regardless of their academic record. Still, at Mesmer, nearly 90% go on to college. Jeff Monday is the high school principal.
It is a matter of justice that a parent is able to use a voucher, which is power. Money is power.
Harvard professor Caroline Hawksby researches voucher programs across the country, including students in the Milwaukee program.
They appear to be doing better in the voucher schools after about 3 to 4 years. We can see statistically significant improvements in their achievement in math and reading.
Everybody.
So they're doing a little bit better, spending about half of the money.
Everybody on page 8?
The voucher program also impacts the Milwaukee public schools.
There were just staggering changes in a couple of years. There are schools in Milwaukee that stood to lose virtually 100% of their students if they didn't do something to ensure that their students didn't leave with the voucher. We saw those schools improve their student achievement more in the first 2 years after the voucher program expanded than they had in the previous 30, 35 years.
I don't assume that private schools are better than public schools. I assume that competition is a way in which both public and private schools can be required to satisfy their customers.
Let's start with number 5 up there.
In which the bad private schools will fail and the bad public schools will fail. So the fundamental assumption is simply that competition is better than monopoly.
Milton and Rose have created the Friedman Foundation to continue the fight for school choice. By the 1960s, Milton's writings and lectures are gaining international attention. Their home movies recall their foreign travel. A trip to India, where Milton had advised the government 6 years earlier, and trips throughout Europe, Asia, and the Middle East.
The worst of Israel's problems is inflation. One of the experts the new government has turned to for advice is Professor Milton Friedman.
Milton's ideas about economics and how to fight inflation are always the topic of conversation.
I suspect that you could not find an economist in Israel, whatever his political coloration, who would not agree with most of what I've said. The problem is a political problem of how do you put it into effect.
Although Milton had advised government leaders around the world, he had until now never participated in politics at home.
The 1964 presidential campaign is officially launched.
President Lyndon Johnson is running for re-election after the assassination of John Kennedy.
Make no mistake, there is no such thing as a conventional nuclear weapon.
His challenger is Senator Barry Goldwater.
When I say that America must take a firm line with communist leaders until their evil system ceases to threaten the world.
Goldwater and Milton share similar ideas about limiting government and deregulating industries. Milton becomes an economic advisor to the Goldwater campaign.
During that year, he was very active, not only in the campaign, but in speaking throughout New York City and being considered this crazy economist who was actually supporting Barry Goldwater. There were very few intellectuals who were supporting Barry Goldwater at that time.
President Johnson successfully portrays Goldwater as a radical, and Goldwater loses in one of the biggest landslides in American history. Richard Parker.
Goldwater's defeat was so disastrous, so overwhelming, that Galbraith thought that Friedman's ideas, along with Goldwater's candidacies, had pretty much finished the far right off in American politics.
It looked like a low point for these ideas, and I think most people thought that at the time.
But within 4 years, Friedman's ideas would once again be tested on the national political scene. By the mid-1960s, America is becoming increasingly embroiled in the conflict in Southeast Asia. As more and more Americans die in Vietnam, the public debate intensifies.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Richard Nixon emerges as the Republican candidate. Milton is invited to serve as an advisor to Nixon. During these years, Milton and others succeed with a dramatic and far-reaching policy initiative.
The use of compulsion is repugnant to our society except in cases of dire emergency.
Milton had been writing and lecturing about the benefits of ending the draft and creating an all-volunteer military.
It is long past time that we return to our basic heritage, got rid of the compulsion in our military service, and return to a voluntary system.
Now the unpopular Vietnam War has driven the issue from the lecture halls to the streets.
I talked to quite a number of SDS groups, and I always got along very well with them because it was clear that our objectives were the same. And what we were talking about was not objectives, but how you achieve those objectives.
As the draft becomes one of the hottest issues of the day, President Nixon creates a commission to consider change. He appoints Milton Friedman and Alan Greenspan.
We had a couple of generals on that commission who obviously were brought up with the draft, believed it was essential. And a general who came before us in testimony.
And so I spoke up and said, General Westmoreland, would you rather command a slave force? And he said, I don't like to hear my drafted soldiers referred to as slaves. And I said, I don't like to hear my patriotic volunteers referred to as mercenaries.
Milton sat there and took his arguments apart piece by piece, never raised his voice.
In any event, General Westmoreland, You are a mercenary general, and I am a mercenary professor. We are served by a mercenary lawyer. We are served by a mercenary doctor.
The general got redder and redder, and at the end of this little set of dissections, the mercenary argument was thoroughly demolished.
And that was the end of the discussion.
Martin Anderson was one of Nixon's official advisors.
I wrote a policy paper recommending getting rid of the draft, and I borrowed liberally from Milton's paper. And Nixon agreed, switched his policy from a universal military service. He advocated it, drove it in the campaign, and in 1971, we eliminated the draft.
Today, Milton still downplays his personal role in ending the draft.
Many people were writing in favor of a volunteer army. It was not my idea in any way, shape, form, or manner.
Milton is rarely wrong about anything. He's wrong about that.
The ramifications have been enormous. Nobody has gone back and said, no, this crazy idea that Milton had way back in the 60s, what were the ramifications? I'll tell you, we now have the most powerful force in the world.
And so the American military, long guaranteed a steady supply of recruits from the draft, had suddenly been forced into the marketplace.
Hey, Sergeant Major.
Brigadier General Sean Byrne was a draftee, one of the last. Today, he is the Army's Director of Military Personnel.
We're in a market economy, and we understand that, and we have what I think is a great product.
This one speaks to our ethnic diversity as well as the MOS.
The Army spends $200 million a year to advertise that product.
Helicopter. There's some dialogue back and forth.
Leo Burnett is one of the nation's oldest and largest advertising agencies. They have been creating ad campaigns for the Army since before 9/11. The account director is Ray DeThorne.
Advertising for the armed forces is much more complicated than it is for a consumer product. Going into an armed forces, it's a life decision.
You're changed, man. How's that?
We began crafting ads to reach influencers and specifically parents.
So, Dad, there's something I need to tell you. How much is this gonna cost me?
And even more specifically, mothers.
My mom, please.
It's the mom who basically stands in the door and says, whoa, wait a minute.
Knowing right from wrong and believing in myself. Wanting to go to college, that came from you.
We're not trying to varnish over any kind of issues. It's tough. You can't tell them a lie, because all they have to do is watch TV at night, and they know what the Army's about. Now, in today's environment, the great thing is we have 502,000 soldiers in the Army today. Every one of those soldiers is a volunteer.
With the battle against the draft won and the creation of an all-volunteer force a reality, Milton continues to press home his argument for minimum government and individual freedom. He could not know that years earlier and 8,000 miles away, seeds of the most public clash in his life had already been sown. Between 1955 and 1964, graduate students from Santiago's prestigious Catholic University had received scholarships to study economics at the University of Chicago. Most of the students developed ideas on free markets and freedom similar to those of Milton Friedman and others at the university. They became known as the Chicago Boys. In 1970, with the support of Cuba's Fidel Castro, Chile elects the first communist president in the Western world. Salvador Allende immediately nationalizes basic industries and controls prices and wages. The Chicago Boys remain quietly in the background. One of them is Rolf Luders, who earned his PhD with Milton.
Under Allende, the rate of increase in prices annualized of the month of September 73 was 1,000%, 1,000%.
There are food shortages and strikes. The basis of the economy is copper, and the miners strike dozens of times in just 2 years. The banging of pots and pans is the sound of a revolution in the making. On September 11, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet leads a military coup against Allende. It is covertly supported by the United States. Pinochet and his generals bomb the presidential palace. Allende is either murdered or commits suicide. The Chilean economy continues to decline. In time, Pinochet begins to listen to the Chicago boys as they offer their proposal for economic recovery. In the midst of the turmoil, Milton Friedman accepts an invitation from a local foundation to speak in Santiago about economic freedom.
And he said, there's one condition for me to talk to the press, that I can say whatever I want to say. And I said, sure, why don't you do it? And what do you want to say? And he said, well, I want to talk about, the benefits of a free economy and so on. But I also want to say that a free economy has to be accompanied by a free democratic elections and a free government. And I said, well, maybe Pinochet will not like that very much. And he said, well, that's too bad, As I recall, Milton Friedman said opening the economy up to international trade was a key element of any economic reform. Freeing prices was absolutely correct. Getting rid of all these regulations which inhibited entrepreneurships were great. And it was a brief meeting, maybe half an hour or so, or 45 minutes, and that was it.
And so Milton Friedman publicly and privately agrees with the Chicago boys that a relatively short but painful shock treatment is needed to save Chile from the disaster of continued inflation.
Large groups of Chileans paid a high price for the change of system. This meant low incomes, meant high unemployment, meant bankruptcies. You cannot have a free economy without political freedom. And if you have political freedom, you need economic freedom to preserve political freedom.
In December 1976, Milton arrives in Stockholm to accept the Nobel Prize in Economics. The news of his trip to Chile and his conversation with Augusto Pinochet has preceded him.
From the time we have landed in Sweden, we had 24-hour police protection. There was this demonstration of about 5,000 people in front of the Nobel ceremony place. In order to go from the one place to the other, we had to go out of a back door.
You people have such a distorted idea of what went on. Let me tell you some facts. Number one, I was offered 2 honorary degrees by universities in Chile before I went down. I refused to take them because those universities were being supported in part by public funds, and I did not want to appear in any way to provide any support to the political system in Chile. I'm not a representative of Chile. I'm not an advisor to Chile. I have no commitments to the government of Chile.
I now turn to you, Professor Milton Friedman.
Friedman, go home! Friedman, go home!
The young man induced his father to pass the ticket on to him. And he came to the ceremony with the express purpose of making a disturbance.
I am very sorry for this incident. It could have been worse. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences ask you to step forward and receive from the hand of His Majesty the 1976 Nobel Memorial Prize.
Let me emphasize that the Swedish people were wonderful. There was a very large number of people who came up to us and apologized for what had happened.